Welcome everyone to the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society's Fireside Chat with Ministers Guilbeault, Murray and Wilkinson. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous pour cette conversation organisée par la Société pour la Nature et les Parcs du Canada avec les ministres Wilkinson, Murray et Guilbeault. Before we get started, please note for our audience attending by Zoom, you can find a few tips about how to access the translation options in the chat in English and French. I'm Sandra Schwartz, the National Executive Director for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, or CPAWS as we're affectionately known, and I am your host tonight. We welcome and thank everyone who's tuning in to our virtual event right now through Zoom and Facebook Live, including our donors and supporters. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and I thank the Algonquin Nation for hosting us on their land. Avant de commencer, je tiens à préciser que je vis et travaille sur le territoire uncédé du peuple algonquin. We are very excited to welcome our Fireside Chat guests. Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, Steven Guilbeault, Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard, Joyce Murray, and Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson. We are also excited to welcome our Fireside Chat moderator, Shawn McCarthy. We're thrilled to have the ministers join us this evening for a discussion on Canada's nature conservation commitments at such a critical time. With the ever-intensifying impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss being felt across the country, including the flooding overwhelming British Columbia and the unprecedented decline of species, it is clear that these two crises are interconnected. Our plans to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss must be coordinated, and they must include working in partnership with Indigenous peoples to protect Canada's natural spaces. Supporting Indigenous-led conservation will be key in our efforts to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and to fight climate change. Canada's already made commitments to work toward increasing ambition to protect nature, including protecting 25% of the country's land and ocean by 2025 and 30% by 2030, and funding Indigenous-led conservation initiatives and guardians programs. The federal government is also committed to creating 10 new national parks, 10 new marine conservation areas, and 15 new urban national parks. Exciting changes are taking place right now with the ministers fulfilling new roles, and you'll be hearing directly from them on how they'll plan to deliver on Canada's critical nature commitments. Nature protection is at the core of CPAWS' mission, and CPAWS is Canada's only charity dedicated to the protection of public land, freshwater, and ocean, with a strong national and regional presence across the country. Working in a way that respects the sovereignty and leadership of Indigenous nations, we are focused on conserving nature to respond to the dual crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. Our vision is that at least half of the land, freshwater, and ocean in Canada is permanently protected to sustain nature and people for current and future generations. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions in advance through our registration form. Be sure to stick around until the very end, where we'll round off our fireside chat with a couple of audience submitted questions. And with that, I'll hand it over to our moderator, Shawn McCarthy.
Thank you, Sandra, and good evening, everybody. Welcome, and I just want to extend my thanks to CPAWS for inviting me to participate in, I think, what is a really important conversation now with these three ministers. In addition to all the work that has to get done on nature, the government has already kicked off consultations on a new climate plan that is going to be delivered early in the new year, relatively early in the new year. And we can get into some conversation about how nature and biodiversity will go hand in hand with climate protection and adaptation as the government makes its very ambitious plans and at the same time has to take into account inclusion and just transition. So we don't envy you your job here. Let's jump right in and start off, Minister Murray and Minister Guilbeault, with questions for you both. Similar question, I guess, one with oceans, one with terrestrial targets, and that is, how do you plan to meet your government's commitment to protect 25% of Canada's land and ocean by 2025 and 30% by 2030? What are the big opportunities and challenges you anticipate in delivering on these targets? So, Minister Murray, if we could start with you.
Well, thanks, Shawn, and thank you, Sandra. And congratulations, Sandra, on what CPAWS has done over the years to push for this kind of protection. Nature needs half. One of your slogans. It does remind me of being an environment minister when we had 12% of BC was protected in parks, and there was a big consensus amongst industry that we should roll back 2% because really 10% is enough. So we have an ambitious target of 30% by 2030, and for marine protected areas, of course, and land. I'm delighted to share with two other experienced and well-known environmental leaders, which is Jonathan and Steven. And I know that it's going to be fun working together on this. So, I mean, what are the challenges and opportunities? I'm really focused on the opportunity right now because I'm 5 weeks into this job. And I think the opportunity with marine protected areas is enormous. It's an opportunity to advance our reconciliation intentions and commitments. It's an opportunity to work collaboratively even more deeply with communities and environmental organizations. It's an opportunity to really see oceans and coastal areas as a big partner in our climate action objectives and really explore the blue carbon aspect of restoring and regenerating the habitats, restoring and regenerating stocks so that we have the abundance that means that we're able to enjoy fishing and fish for our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren while absorbing carbon and contributing to our targets. So there's so many opportunities with this. I'm really excited about it. The challenges are the ones that are always inherent in having ambition, big ambition. And my experience is that people that are excited about the outcome learn to work together to work out the kinks along the way. And so I'm very optimistic optimistic. I mean, we've already gone from 1% to over 13% of oceans areas protected. So this has been something our government has been working on for a while, but this challenges us to go further and be even more ambitious. So this is great for fish, it's great for oceans, and it's something that it's a privilege to be part of.
Thank you, Minister Guilbeault.
Thank you, Shawn. Merci beaucoup à la SNAP et à Sandra de m'avoir invité ici ce soir. Et en fait, je pense qu'on a 3 ministres qui représentent des portefeuilles qui sont clés pour la protection de la nature. Joyce, qui vient de parler au département des pêches et des océans. Jonathan, aux ressources naturelles et moi au changement climatique et à l'environnement. Et en fait, Jonathan a été ou est responsable des 3. Alors, il a fait pêche et océan, environnement et là maintenant ressources naturelles. Comme Joyce vient de le dire, elle a été elle-même ministre de l'Environnement et elle a fait carrière dans le secteur de la foresterie avant ça. C'est d'ailleurs comme ministre de l'Environnement de la Colombie-Britannique que je l'ai rencontré pour la première fois il y a de ça quand même quelques années. Et je pense que en fait, on peut dire que le Canada n'a jamais eu une équipe ministérielle à la fois aussi unifiée et compétente en matière de conservation de la nature. Et moi, ce qui m'a amené à me présenter en 2019, c'était de voir comment notre parti, qui n'était pas encore mon parti à l'époque, mais était en train de faire de la question de l'environnement, de la conservation, de la lutte au changement climatique, non pas l'affaire d'un ministre ou d'une ministre, mais l'affaire du gouvernement. Et c'est ce qu'on a vu d'ailleurs en 2019, quand dans toutes les lettres de mandat de chacun des ministres du cabinet, on retrouvait la question des changements climatiques comme l'un des deux éléments qui étaient communs, et l'autre étant celui de la réconciliation. And I think, I mean, since over the last 4 years, we've made significant commitments to nature conservation in Canada. The largest, the one in 2018, 1.3 billions, and the one in 2021, 4.1 billions. And I mean, some of you would remember that, and Sarah would remember that. But at the time that I was in the environmental movement, and Équiterre was part of the Green Budget Coalition, and we would come to the federal government, you know, year after year with budget proposals, no one would have dared to ask for billions of dollars for anything to do with climate change or conservation or environmental protection. I mean, it was, we'd be shy to ask for $500 million for this or that. And I mean, since 2018, as a whole, our government has invested around $100 billion in the green recovery, in clean tech, and in conservation efforts. So I think we have started to take significant steps, but the task ahead should not be underestimated. Getting to 25 by 25 and 30 by 30 will not be easy, but I believe, and we believe as a government, that it can be done. And I think one of the key to that is bringing Canadians on board. And certainly, conceptually, people, there was some polling done by some of your colleagues in CPAWS Southern Alberta, I believe, did some pollings that came out earlier this week about conservation, specifically in Alberta, and the numbers are very encouraging. But I think we need collectively to do a better job at helping the public understand how important it is, but also what a challenge it represents, because we as government, members of a government, need public buy-in to make even bigger investment in nature. And I think I'm certainly encouraged by what I have been seeing. I mean, many of you will know that very well, but historically, we've tended to talk about climate change in one silo and nature in another, nature and conservation, and oceans in another one, as if the ecosphere makes any differences between these things. And I think, to their credit, the British government, as part of COP26, really made a concerted effort to ensure that we see and we work as being linked, totally linked, and the intersections between them. And that's encouraging. That was necessary, and I think it's very promising for the future as well. So, and we are committed to providing an equitable, nature positive, carbon neutral future at home and obviously abroad, because these issues are certainly global issues that can't be dealt with just in Canada. So I think we are on the right path, and we know we need to do more. Puis aujourd'hui, je suis très heureux de vous annoncer que nous avons lancé le prochain appel de proposition pour des solutions fondées sur la nature, doté d'un budget de 200 millions de dollars sur 5 ans, qui fait partie du Fonds des solutions climatiques axées sur la nature. Alors, je vais m'arrêter là. J'ai beaucoup d'autres choses à dire, mais je ne veux pas prendre trop de temps non plus. Merci beaucoup, Shawn.
Yeah, I feel like every one of these questions, each one of you could probably give a full-length speech on. So I appreciate as we get into it, we'll be able to dig down a little bit. You've both mentioned an all-of-government approach on this, and with the intertwined biodiversity and climate crisis, really requires enormous effort and in fact a whole of government approach. So how do you work together? Government departments often, even though you sit at a cabinet table together, departments can often operate as silos. So how do you work recognizing that that what is nature to one group is the area of work for the resource industry, and you're going to have a lot of feedback, no doubt, from people who work in the resource sector and rely on it for livelihoods and so on. So if we could go to you, Minister Guilbeault, and then Minister Wilkinson, what's the approach to making sure that you can align the economic and the environmental objectives at the same time?
Yeah, that's a good question, Shawn. I think we are trying we're trying to do things differently in a number of ways. The first briefings that I had as Environment and Climate Change Minister, and that Minister Wilkinson had as Natural Resource Minister, we did them jointly. Both ministers and a senior level representative from our departments. And we're doing that on an ongoing basis. So to avoid this dichotomy that we've seen in the past, and same with Minister Murray on certain issues, environment, working together with DFO on this, and Minister Murray and I haven't started having joint briefings together, but that's coming. Minister Wilkinson and I are even sitting together in the House of Commons. They sat right next to each other, for better or for worse. You'll have to ask Minister Wilkinson about that. But some may say it's symbolic, and I guess you could argue that, but I think it is also a way for us to send a powerful message, and that message is that we're working together. And that you won't see this type of, certainly as an environmentalist over the years, you would expect our two ministries to be, if not in constant, in regular battle against each other, and that's not happening right now. And more globally, I mean, certainly in terms of conservation, we are trying to, moving it back to environment, right, for a minute, we are looking at a three-pronged approach for our action because of very different conditions. So what we're doing in the south of Canada and the approach we have to the south of Canada won't be the same as when we're trying to get projects moving in the middle or the north of Canada. Donc, au nord, on a de très grands espaces intacts, sauvages, où on peut et on a commencé à travailler avec les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les gouvernements territoriaux. Et j'étais cette semaine en rencontre avec des représentants du gouvernement du Yukon, et on a plusieurs projets très intéressants qui ont été construits en collaboration avec les peuples autochtones, dont la plupart sont des nations souveraines au Yukon, 14 nations sur 18, si ma mémoire est bonne. Et donc, les nations autochtones, le gouvernement du Yukon et le gouvernement fédéral. Je pense qu'il y a des très bonnes nouvelles qui s'en viennent à ce niveau-là. On sait que les stocks de carbone dans le nord sont très importants, à la fois au niveau des milieux humides et de la forêt boréale. Des projets comme celui de Edeshai, la nation Edeshai, dans les territoires du Nord-Ouest, donc un espace protégé avec le peuple Deisho, annoncé en 2018, mais c'est 14 000 km², et c'est le premier espace de protection qui a été piloté par les Premières Nations, mais ce n'est certainement pas le dernier. En mai dernier, le ministre Wilkinson a signé une entente pour un espace de conservation maritime dans la partie ouest de la baie James et la partie sud-ouest de la baie du Tson, qui va faire, une fois que ce sera complété, l'équivalent du Portugal. Alors bon, je pourrais continuer, mais vous comprenez que the approach we have for how we want to do this in Northern Canada won't be the same in different regions. We have to adapt the way we do this. Certainly more challenging trying to do that in the south than in the north because of the density of population of industrial activities. But at the same time, and as Sarah was saying in her introduction, we've committed to the creation of new national parks, and some will likely be in the north, but not all of them. And we've committed to create urban parks because clearly, if the pandemic showed Canadians something that people on this call would know very well, is how precious and how much we need our green spaces. I mean, I live right in front of a not so big park in Montreal, but fairly big park. And during the pandemic, there were more people in the park in front of my house than you would find in a Habs game. Now, I know the Habs are not doing very well this year, and one could try to attribute it to that. But I mean, clearly, that's the only place people could go. So we will be working to ensure that those efforts we're doing are distributed across the geography and not just in places where people can't or would have really difficulty accessing those protected areas.
Minister Wilkinson, in terms of the resource sector and what role it will play as you try to set aside for protection more and more of Canada's landmass and oceans.
Je voudrais commencer de dire merci aux Sociétés pour la Nature et les Parcs du Canada d'avoir convoqué cette conversation très importante. I would say that, as has been said a couple of times, it's not enough for us going forward to aim for a world that is carbon neutral, even though climate change probably gets far more play than the issues around the decline in biodiversity. We have to aim to achieve a future that is both carbon neutral and nature positive. And that means that sustainability, broadly defined, has to be at the core of everything we do. That certainly does mean conservation. It means parks, it means protected spaces. It means that we can't do certain kinds of things that produce emissions in significant quantities. But there is an economic component to sustainability as well. If our focus is solely on conservation, we run the risk of losing Canadians along this journey. Canadians expect us to be thoughtful about how we ensure that we reduce emissions and that we actually protect and enhance biodiversity in this country. But they also expect us to create jobs and economic opportunity for their children. And that's true both in the context of addressing climate, and it's true of ensuring that we are appropriately protecting nature. It includes, in the future, with respect to climate, obviously things around renewable energy and biofuels, building efficiency, hydrogen, and a whole range of other things. But it also includes things like sustainable mining that enables Canada to be a world leader in the production of critical minerals and batteries, electric vehicles. It includes sustainable forestry that enables Canada to be a world leader in the manufacturing and export of low carbon building products, for example, while clearly needing to respect and be very sensitive to the demands and the requirements of biodiversity, including things like stopping the decline and turning around the decline in boreal and southern mountain caribou, for example. So we need to think holistically, we need to think collectively. That certainly does mean that we need to work across silos within government. Certainly means we need to engage with the environmental community, with business community, the labor movement, and of course, Indigenous peoples. I would say that, one good example of I think, something that was done by this government that actually was an important step, and I think one that we will all look to continue to refine and utilize going forward, was the development of the Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy, the climate plan, which we convened ministers from across the government that had a hand in the climate portfolio, that had tools that related to climate change very early on, as at the height of the pandemic, to start to have conversations that ultimately resulted in perhaps one of the most integrated and comprehensive plans that certainly we've seen in Canada, and I would say that have been seen anywhere in the world. And certainly my friends, Minister Guilbeault, who was Minister of Heritage at the time, was very, very significantly involved in that, and Joyce Murray, who was Minister of Digital Government, was involved in that. It is extremely important that we find ways to ensure that we are working across silos in a common with a common view about what we're trying to achieve from a collective perspective. And we often use the term whole of government. We often don't know what we mean when we say that. But that was, I think, a really good example of a whole of government approach that resulted in something that was an enormous step forward for Canada. We need to be doing that more regularly. And as I say, there are two sides of the coin. There is the climate and nature piece, and then there are the economic opportunities. We can't forget either of them. We just have to ensure that they're working hand in hand.
All right, thank you very much. So on to the next question, if I could. And we'll start, Minister Wilkinson, with you and bring Minister Murray into it. And that, it really does focus on the oceans. What does it mean when we talk about minimum protection standards that you announced, Minister Wilson, for the ocean protected areas? What kind of activities are going to be allowed? Are we totally prohibiting oil and gas mining, dumping and bottom trawling? What challenges and opportunities around these protected areas did you encounter in putting it together? And then Minister Murray, do you encounter in implementing the program?
Well, certainly that was a long series of conversations and discussions that resulted in those standards. But those standards were specific to different kinds of protection. So there were the formal sort of marine protected areas, and then there were, of course, what are called other effective area-based measures. There are different things that are allowed in different forms of protection. For marine protected areas, we made the commitment that we would not do bottom trawling and oil and gas development and mining in those spaces. In other effective area-based measures, there are often sustainable fisheries that are allowed, for example. And even in marine protected areas, at times there can be sustainable fisheries, but they obviously have to be sustainable. And that was a process that certainly wasn't a simple one. There are certainly interests that find that at times they are in conflict with those kinds of conservation. I think at the end of the day, what we need to do and what we did, and I know what Joyce is continuing to do, is to ensure that we are striking the appropriate balance, which is there are some spaces where we simply must provide overall very strong protection. And that's partly about protecting species that exist there. It's partly about actually ensuring that there are spaces where the reproduction can actually happen. What they often find is when you actually put in place marine protected areas, that the abundance of fish outside the marine protected areas goes up because of the protections that exist within the space. So those are really important. I would also say that outside of formal protected areas, there's also an ongoing issue to look at how you can manage the interaction between industrial use and the protection and the enhancement of biodiversity. So for example, in BC, the work that we have done to protect southern resident killer whales in an area where there is a lot of shipping traffic. The same thing is true with les baleines noires dans l'est du Canada, où il y a encore beaucoup de transports maritimes. On doit penser très fort et on doit avoir beaucoup de conversations, mais on doit trouver les équilibres dans lesquels on peut protéger les espèces en péril, mais aussi avoir les économiques qui peuvent assurer qu'il y a les emplois pour les gens qui vivent dans les régions du Canada.
Thank you, Minister Murray. If you can pick up on that, since you are picking now, literally picking up on that work done and moving it forward.
Yeah, and so happy to be doing that and building on the work that that Jonathan and after him Bernadette Jordan, the minister, and before that Dominique LeBlanc, because this has been a progression over the last 6 years, and we've had some, I think, very forward-looking ministers in DFO. There's fish stocks in trouble on both coasts. And, I think most people cannot imagine a future without fish. So restoring them to the abundance that we once had really is a critical part of what DFO needs to be doing. And I see these marine protected areas as part of that. I'm very focused on regeneration. I was talking about regeneration of habitats as well as stocks. This isn't a one size fits all though, Shawn, and I think Jonathan made that pretty clear. We have the longest coastline in the world in Canada, more than twice as long as any other country. And so that means we have a great variety of ocean and coastal ecosystems. And so different protected areas will need to focus on different elements that require protection. And so that's where we're saying that it's we have to negotiate with the other partners, the Indigenous communities, the industry, the fishers, and Indigenous, and make sure that we are really tailoring each one to the situation. I think underneath all of this, we need to really develop and restore public trust in government's ability to manage oceans and fisheries and the environment in a way that is really is for the long run. And at the same time, people's jobs matter, whether it's Indigenous communities or whether it's fishing communities on the east coast of Canada or the west coast or even lakes in the middle of Canada. And I do bring that perspective because my first 25 years of my career, I was a tree planter and a tree planting contractor. So I've been in remote areas in BC, Alberta, Ontario. I know what it's like to work on the land and the water in all kinds of weather and seasons where it would be more comfortable to be inside a home in Vancouver. So I get how hard that work is and how important it is, especially to remote communities that depend on those resources for their livelihood. So we can't ignore that. And at the same time, we all need to think about what are we doing to ensure that that the abundance that we used to have is something that we can have once again, so that that's available in the long term. So that you asked about challenges and opportunities. I think that that restoration and regeneration of abundance challenge, given that it is so critical for so many individuals and communities who depend on ocean abundance today, to be able to fish, and finding the way forward together by looking at the legacy that we want to provide for our next generation, and as Canadians, the legacy that we want to provide on the global stage. Because if a wealthy country like Canada can't be a leader in finding that balance, including people and regenerating and restoring our ocean environments, then who can?
Right. It's a very similar challenge, isn't it, with climate change, and that is trying to address in the short term where you face disruption and challenges in terms of managing limited resources for the future when people rely on those resources for today. Let me ask about Indigenous-led conservation and engagement, and what role, and this is I think one that you can all address. What role will Indigenous-led conservation engagement, including the Indigenous protected and conserved areas and the Indigenous Guardians program, play in the course of your work? How do we incorporate Indigenous leadership in the work that the government and that other communities around the country are going to be doing? Why don't we start with you, Minister Guilbeault, and then Minister Murray and Minister Wilkinson, if we could.
Thank you, Shawn. Frankly, I don't see a path forward on conservation without the involvement and in many cases projects being led by Indigenous people. And I think that's what we're starting to see. C'est une chose qui est relativement nouvelle dans notre univers canadien de la conservation. Ça fait pas très longtemps qu'on a commencé à faire ça. Ça fait quelques années. Mais dans le dernier budget, il y a plus de 350 millions qui visent spécifiquement ça, des projets qui sont menés par les peuples autochtones. Et c'est clair que l'avenir des projets de conservation et dans bien des cas de la co-gestion de plusieurs de ces projets-là va se faire en collaboration avec les peuples autochtones.
Mr. Murray?
I'm just listening to a bell that's down the hallway in the minister's regional office here. Sorry about the interruption that it's creating. So, I mean, firstly, Indigenous people have managed forests and managed coastal ecosystems for millennia. They didn't just gather and utilize the resources, they actually managed them. And so that understanding about how to alter the coastal, the estuary or the beach or the forest, how to alter it in a way to have it be productive in a sustainable way is part of their culture. So I think it's by bringing that knowledge in, we can do a much better job. I mean, frankly, I would say that the colonizers over the last hundreds of years on the East Coast and the West Coast, when I think of oceans and coasts, and the North Coasts haven't done really a great job. So I would say we need Indigenous peoples working with us, and their perspectives about how what they're doing is so critical for their children and their grandchildren to be able to learn and to both have the benefit of the resource that they harvest, but also have the abundance of resource for the next generation. So they really live and bring those values. So that's one aspect of it. We're already seeing that in forestry in British Columbia, we've had a very two-dimensional approach to forestry. We being the industry and all of those working in it, and having access to the rights, the tree farm licenses and timber licenses. Why do I say that? Because it's been about harvesting the most valuable species and replanting them. And so I know that industry. Then it went into, well, actually, we won't just replant the most valuable species for our mills. We'll replant a variety of conifers. We'll put in spruce, fir, pine, cedar. We'll do a mix. Well, that happened in about the 80s or 90s. But that is not good enough. And that's still kind of where the industry is today. What we saw with the wildfires in British Columbia is a great deal of devastation I mean, this has been happening since 2003 when I was environment minister, and we had fires and homes lost in Kelowna. We've been having these runaway wildfires. Well, why? One of the reasons is the brush and the deciduous trees have been suppressed with brush suppression, as opposed to allowed to be part of the forest in the way they were for millennia for the Indigenous occupants. And so that means that the natural ways of stopping fire from spreading are no longer there. We weren't listening. The Indigenous peoples in some of these interior forests, there is 100 products out of forest that they utilize for food or pharmaceuticals. And some of those products were stop the fires from spreading because deciduous trees don't act in the same way. So we have a lot to learn in the forests, in how we manage forests for the long term, for resilience and sustainability while we benefit from the products. And I am of the view that we have the same that we need to learn from Indigenous peoples as we figure out how to manage oceans and coastlines in a way to restore the abundance we once used to have while providing the economic activities and benefits for communities. So that's on the practical side. And I would say on the moral side, having just spoken with some leaders of Indigenous communities from around the Port Alberni area, and of course we had the Alberni residential school, we have a moral obligation to not just include, but to really help advance the interests of Indigenous peoples after over a century of undermining the opportunities, I mean, to put it mildly, and fairness, equality, and just humanitarian treatment that the Indigenous children didn't have, or many of them didn't have for so long. So, and all of the consequences of that. So we have a moral duty, but really a practical benefit from bringing Indigenous people into every aspect of what we're doing. So I'm looking forward to working with Indigenous communities in that way as we do this incredibly exciting program of regenerating, rebuilding, restoring the abundance that we used to have through marine protected areas and other mechanisms. We do have some exciting programs coming up, like the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, with its quite a lot of funding to think about how to restore and regenerate our wild Pacific salmon. The blue economy strategy, which I think is going to have to include blue carbon, so as the climate side of it, but we have a creative opportunity to think about the jobs that people count on related to oceans and coasts and waterways, and what are new ways that we can envision that advances the sustainability and restoration of abundance while providing jobs. So there's some funding and some ideas, and we will be working hand in hand with Indigenous individuals and communities as we go forward.
That's a very complete answer. I don't know how much you can add to that, Minister Wilkinson, but let me ask you, just at a very practical level, and Minister Murray did talk about some of the practical aspects of it, in addition to the more principled ones. But at a very practical level, how does a government incorporate Indigenous leadership into decision making, and at the same time deal with other stakeholders, communities, business, often who see, and I think I know government is well past this, but I'm not sure everybody is seeing the Indigenous communities as another stakeholder as opposed to right holders. So how do you operationalize this approach?
Well, there are probably a range of ways, some of them more formal and probably more national. So, in the discussion, for example, on climate change, there are tables with First Nations, with Inuit, and with Métis that are actually government-to-government forums for the discussion of how we actually move forward on climate. And there are similar kinds of forums with respect to nature. There also are formal mechanisms that we built into processes. So the new Impact Assessment Act, which was brought into place, it was Bill C-69 at the time before it became law, requires consultation and discussion at the front end of any project with Indigenous communities that maybe have an interest or be impacted. And that early planning phase is a critical phase and perhaps one of the most novel parts of the new Impact Assessment Act. But I would also say that there are, in this discussion around conservation, I mean, if you step back and you think about reconciliation generally, there are a range of things that people mean by that. At least 4 of them are services, water and those kinds of things. It's governance and dealing on a nation-to-nation basis. But there's also the connection with nature and the economic benefits that accrue from industry, that the industrial activities that happen within traditional territories. And I think here we're talking about mainly the last two. And I agree with Steven in the sense that the progress that we've made terrestrially and increasingly on the marine side has been the product of a partnership with Indigenous communities across this country. I mean, Kaliyuruptapigmanga and Last Ice was done in partnership with the Inuit peoples, and it was one of the biggest steps forward in terms of protection, marine protection in this country's history. Many of the protected areas that we have done terrestrially have been Indigenous conserved and protected areas that we have done in many different parts of this country. That's about nature protection. That's about working on reconciliation, and that is about governance within these constructs. It's about Indigenous guardians programs that actually provide economic opportunity and jobs for communities. And on the economic side, it's also about finding ways to ensure that Indigenous communities actually gain fruits from the industries that happen within the traditional territories. When I was in Joyce's job, one of the things that we did, of which I was most proud, was an arrangement with the Coastal First Nations, where we essentially provided funding to allow them to essentially buy into half of the fishery in their traditional territories, providing jobs and economic opportunity on an ongoing basis, doing traditional activities that are really important culturally. There are enormous opportunities for us to do that. One of the things I've been tasked to work on is a national benefit sharing framework with respect to resource projects. And I think that's something that we are going to have to do, because the economic part of reconciliation is as important, perhaps even more important than others. Because at the end of the day, the path forward for many of these communities in terms of being self-sufficient and independent requires that they have an economic base.
All right, well, thank you very much for those answers. We now have an opportunity to take questions that, from the audience, and these were provided to us ahead of time. They solicited from the audience questions, and obviously we received a lot of questions, and we won't be able to get to all of them, but I think these are fairly representative. And there was reference from Sabrina from Quebec. There was reference a couple of times to, different approaches in different regions in terms of protection and conservation. How will you ensure that you are protecting the wide variety of land and seascapes found in Canada, including in southern environments, and not sort of going to the more remote places and giving undue prominence to those? Not that those don't need protection too, but how do you ensure that you protect a wide variety of land and seascapes? And I guess Minister Guilbeault and Minister Murray can deal with that one quickly, please, because we want to get to a bunch of them.
Well, I think I answered that earlier. It will be our approach to work on projects that will happen in all parts of the country, and just not in the northern part of our country. I was talking about urban parks earlier, and how certainly we've seen an increased understanding by a great number of people in the South of the importance of having access to nature in a way we've never done before. I think it's also about looking at doing things differently. For example, we now have an infrastructure nature-based fund to implement nature-based solutions that will have obvious conservation and nature-related benefits, but will also help us and are helping us to adapt to climate change. And what we're doing in the western part of Montreal, and there are not a lot of projects happening like that right now, but there are some projects where we are doing this, and we will be doing this more and more. But who would have thought just a few years ago that we could use infrastructure money, which traditionally in this country has been used for concrete, steel, and pavement, to invest in nature-based solution? That's extremely, it's very novel for our country, and I think it's something we will continue pursuing going forward.
Mr. Murray?
Shawn, what was the essence of the question? Are you talking about
How do you
work?
ensure that the wide variety of seascapes in this case are protected, and that there's not an undue selection of more remote areas where the population pressures might make it easier to do?
Well, I mean, firstly, since we want to have these overlapping benefits of protecting and restoring stock abundance that people count on, like wild Pacific salmon in the west, and in the east, cod and tuna and so on, it does make sense to be working with the coastal communities that depend on those stocks. So I don't see that there is a benefit to selecting easy to protect areas compared with working with people so we can have those multiple layers of benefit. And back just briefly to the question of the Indigenous connection with that, one of the things that previous fisheries ministers have done is build into our new Fisheries Act that we actually have to, by law, include Indigenous people, the roles in project reviews and so on, monitoring and enforcement. And so I expect to see that in our marine protected areas and on our coast.
Very good. Question from Brian from Ontario. And I guess, Minister Guilbeault, this is probably in your lane. How are we going to achieve national land protection and biodiversity goals, including species at risk, when, according to Brian, provinces such as Ontario and others are not taking meaningful action?
So it's a good question. And I mean, listen, clearly on this, we don't necessarily see eye to eye with every provinces in the country. That doesn't mean that we should not try and continue implementing some of the projects that we've talked about tonight and achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves. But it does mean that sometimes, and I've done it recently with the Western chorus frog on the south shore of Montreal, we have some pretty powerful tools at our disposal federally, and we have the ability to use them when a province is not doing what they should be doing. It's not something we can do every day of the week, obviously, but what we have in the past, and we've done so recently. And if we have to do it again in the future, we will certainly do it.
Good. Wendy from Ontario, and I guess this is for you, Minister Wilkinson. What can the federal government do to protect the few remaining stands of old growth forests in Canada? Or maybe it's for both you and Minister Guilbeault, or whoever wants to jump in here, feel free.
I'm happy to at least take the first cut at that. I mean, this is an issue that is very live in British Columbia right now, where these ancient old growth forests have been the subject of logging. And of course, people have read the stories about the protests at Fairy Creek. I mean, what we have said, and this goes back to what Steven was talking about with respect to nature protection. I mean, there is an opportunity to protect, and then there's an opportunity to restore areas that have been disturbed. It's always going to be easier to protect what remains intact. And so, a focus going forward for the Government of Canada, but I would say for provinces generally, has to be the protection of intact ecosystems that are significant from a biodiversity perspective. That has to be right at the top of the list of what you're trying to do with respect to nature protection. That has to include old growth forests in British Columbia. And so we have said to the Government of BC, understanding this is not a simple issue, it's not an easy issue for the Government of BC because forest tenures exist and they are lucrative, and there are many local communities that depend on the forest products industry, that we want to partner with them to help them to figure out how to actually ensure that appropriate protection is brought into place. We've said that we will do that through the Nature Fund, which it was a historic investment in nature, to try to use some of that from a protected space perspective that would include, very much need to include, the Indigenous peoples who live in the relevant areas. But during the election campaign, we also put up a separate and dedicated fund of $50 million to start that conversation and that work, to ensure that we are actually moving forward and moving forward expeditiously, because as the person who asked this question mentioned, there is increasingly less of this area, and once it's gone, it's gone. And so this needs to be a priority, and is a priority for us. And I think we're increasingly seeing that it is becoming a priority for the government of British Columbia, because it is such an important issue.
Good. Let me move on.
I agree with
Mr.
everything that
Guilbeault, to
Jonathan
the
just
last-
said, Shawn.
Pardon?
I agree with everything that Jonathan just said.
Okay, perfect. That gives me an opportunity to move on to the last question of the night. And that's from, well, we heard about Ontario and we heard about BC. So let's move to Alberta. And Barbara from Alberta asks Minister Guilbeault and Minister Wilkinson, what measures can the federal government employ to protect Alberta's eastern slopes and the Prairie Province's water supply? Minister Guilbeault, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, I mean, we've already taken a significant step towards doing that in the previous Parliament. Minister Wilkinson, as Environment and Climate Change Minister, intervened on a number of occasions, and again, it's not always easy. It's not always obvious, but I was in Calgary last week, sitting with my vis-a-vis Minister Nixon. And we don't necessarily see eye to eye on everything, but we have to find ways to work together. And that was really the message that I had for him. And we did talk about conservation. Their views are certainly different than ours, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't sit down and try and find solutions. It may be tough. It may take more time than some of us would like to, but we have an obligation to try and make this happen. You're on mute, Jonathan.
So I agree with Stephen. Maybe I can just add a couple of things. I mean, the eastern slopes, the particular concern that folks have there is the opening up for prospective development of coal mining. And we have taken significant steps. It is a threat to water. It is a threat to water primarily because of selenium discharge that often comes off of coal mines. It is an area I know reasonably well because I used to be involved with a technology company that actually worked on selenium removal systems and technologies. So we definitely understand that is something that people do need to legitimately be concerned about and need to have answers as to how this can be addressed in a thoughtful way. We've done a couple things. I mean, the first is we've essentially said that we don't see thermal coal mines as being in Canada's future. And a number of months ago, we made that statement publicly, given our commitments on climate change, that we didn't see thermal coal mines as something that new mines should be permitted going forward. But with respect to metallurgical coal mines, there are a number of proposals that have been made in the eastern slopes. And what we have said is the selenium issue is such a threat to fish and fish habitat that we have to be certain that in the receiving environment, the particular circumstance of a mine that's being proposed, that what is being proposed would be sufficiently protective for the environment. And therefore, any mine that will discharge selenium, proposed mine that will discharge selenium into a water body must go through a federal environmental assessment. That is a bit of a heavy hand from the federal government, but it is very much focused on the federal government's jurisdiction and responsibility with respect to fish and fish habitat. It is a legitimate concern for people who live in those areas, and it is a responsible position for a government that actually takes the position that nature protection is very important, understanding that we also are looking for responsible economic development.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you for taking these questions, and I think I'll turn it over now to Sandra. You're on mute.
I just realized I was on mute, pardon me. Thank you very much, Shawn, for doing such a fantastic job of moderating our fireside chat this evening. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and joined us both on Zoom and on Facebook Live this evening. I want to also say a very special thanks to Minister Guilbeault, Minister Wilkinson, and Minister Murray for taking the time with us this evening out of your very busy schedules. I know I know what it's like in the House, and Unfortunately, some of you are going to be busy well into the late or early morning. So thank you again for participating with us this evening. Merci à toutes les personnes qui ont participé à notre discussion et un grand merci spécial au ministre Guilbeault et à la ministre Murray et au ministre Wilkinson. I hope you enjoyed hearing from some of the key federal ministers on how they plan to tackle the biodiversity loss and climate change crises in an integrated way. I certainly enjoyed listening in to the three of them speak about this integration and how they plan on working together and how they're going to implement the ambitious promises that have been made to protect Canada's precious land and ocean. I hope you'll all follow us on social media and visit our website at www.cpaws.org or www.snapcanada.org for more information about CPAWS, the work we're doing, and how you can take action to help protect Canada's wilderness. Thanks again and have a great night.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Sarah. Au revoir.